Our resource picture today is bright, but we haven't always been so fortunate. From the beginning of the salmon rush in the 1880s until the passage of the Statehood Act in 1959, the resources of the Alaska Territory were managed by absentee landlords who made their decisions thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. Some would say they were mismanaged, and that the cartels and conglomerates that comprised the Alaska salmon canning industry wielded the real power over Alaska salmon. Federal biologists tried to protect the fish, but their efforts proved ineffective.
Knew at the time that they had to do something, that this isn't an unending resource, that there were limits on it, but I don't believe they really understood management concept.
The Statehood Act of 1959 was largely a referendum on the presence of fish traps in Alaska waters and on the question of who should manage the state's salmon resource and profit from the salmon harvest. Adopted by an overwhelming majority, Alaska's Constitution is unique. It made salmon conservation a constitutional priority and outlawed the traps.
The Constitution of the state set out management of our natural resources as a sustainable resource, but it was defined as a sustainable resource to be harvested as a resource.
State management promised better times ahead, but the impact on the fish stocks wouldn't become apparent for nearly 2 decades. Species like Alaska king, sockeye, and chum salmon spend 3 to 6 years in the ocean before they return to fresh water to spawn.
So even if you make things optimum for them, it's liable to take 2 or 3 full life cycles before the effect of that can be seen on the total abundance of the fish. And if you look at it, that's pretty much what happened.
For Southeast Alaska commercial fishermen, low abundance meant hard times.
If you got 15, 20 king salmon around this area, it was a pretty good day. Now my son-in-law was out there the other day in one spot out here by the Pinnacle. 39 king salmon he let go by 9 o'clock in the morning.
Salmon hatcheries had been used in other regions to enhance fish stocks, and in the 1970s, fishermen in the Ketchikan region concluded that they needed their own hatcheries to boost the salmon harvest.
Well, the fishermen wanted it because we was getting low, and there was fish hatcheries down in Oregon and Washington, California. Why can't we have one?
The state actually built the first hatcheries here, the state and federal government. But the user pays concept was fairly strong in Alaska 30 years ago. And the fishermen themselves, I think they wanted some measure of control.
We just ran out of salmon. I think 1973, 74, there were maybe 25, 26 million salmon in the whole state of Alaska. And Governor Hammond at that time appointed a task force, salmon task force, and they brought back a report to the legislature basically finding Alaska is missing 100 million salmon. And the strategy they laid out was, how do we get our 100 million salmon back?
So what they did was they created a system of enhancing those fisheries, and the main reason was to bring the lowest point of wild survival, or the lowest point of fishery abundance, up to a higher level, basically to put more money in the fishery.
What emerged was the concept of private, non-profit hatcheries funded by Alaska's commercial fishermen.
Well, we needed money to get started. And I just got up and walked up to the desk and put $100 out there.
The program would be funded by fishermen, who in turn would benefit from a more stable resource.
When the private nonprofit structure was put in place in the middle 70s, the fishermen were given a choice to assess themselves 3% of their gross income. And there was an election or a vote, and they chose to do that.
You set up a processing plant, you set up the ability to catch a certain number of fish, you set up the transportation to move those fish, and if you have that industry varying in the volume that they handled, sometimes 2 or 3-fold within a given year, it's tremendously inefficient and problematic to the people that would support it financially. If you can level that lowest line so that a processor can plan how many people to bring, how many lines to run, buy the materials to do that. So a fisherman can know that he's going to fish a full season, get a good crew and set to go. The more stable you can make that industry, obviously the better everyone does.
Even in the 1970s, salmon biologists understood the now widespread public concern that hatchery fish might interbreed with wild fish and adversely affect natural genealogy.
Well, that's something that's relatively controversial now. We take a lot of steps to see that they don't, or absolutely to minimize this. What we've done is site the hatcheries in unique places away from large, important wild fish populations.
Neats Bay was perfect as the site for a private, non-profit salmon hatchery that would have minimal impact on naturally recurring salmon stocks and serve as a means of putting more fish in the ocean for commercial fishermen, for charter captains and the tourists who have traveled to Alaska for the pleasure of catching a salmon, and even for the bears and eagles.
This is actually a classic site. It's a fairly deep bay with no significant fish populations, wild fish populations in it. It's probably 8 miles out to the mouth of the bay. And the second part that's very important about this bay is we can actually conduct a terminal fishery here. It's big enough that we could call in the fleets or fish ourselves to aggressively harvest these fish without, in fact, hurting wild fish or catching wild fish that live in Beam Canal. Also, we have a water source in the back here, which uniquely was somewhat barriered and really never had much of a population of wild fish here. So those three components are fairly important.
If Alaska's salmon abundance had been driven to historic depths in the post-World War II era by a combination of overharvest and mismanagement, the state's pristine environment meant that the damage could be rectified within a generation by controlling the harvest of wild fish and using hatcheries to supplement rather than replace the wild runs. Other states weren't so lucky.
There's a lot of mitigation factors going on in Washington where they had environmental issues, they have dams in the rivers, they've got farming issues, and a lot of different reasons of why to put hatcheries in. And hatcheries were brought in to replace what had been ruined, I guess. Where in Alaska, we didn't have that. We had natural stocks that we had historical basis to say they should be there. And in the early 70s, they weren't. And we just wanted to kind of go in and give a little kickstart to the natural side of it and get more fry out of the systems, out into the ocean, and then let the ocean just rear them, which has been happening. It's been a success.
The main thing with Alaskan salmon is the habitat is basically intact. The salmon is a very old animal. It's a very powerful animal. If you give it a chance, it will always do well.